Hi, this is Eric Vanman. In an earlier video about mesmer and magnetism, I talked about Franz Mesmer, who developed a technique in which people would hold on to rods that were dipped into magnetized water in seances, and then they would have these great emotional reactions and convulsions even. Eventually, Mesmer's methods were debunked by a French royal commission, and Mesmer disappeared into history. In this video, I want to tell you what happened next and how this all led to theories of hysteria in women in the late 1800s, and eventually how Freud trained in what was happening there in Paris. I have two other videos about Freud that you can find linked at the end of this video. A follower of Mesmer, Armand-Marie Jacques de Chastenay, Marquis of Puysegur, was not fond of the convulsive and violent nature of Mesmer's crisis stages depicted in that film clip. During one of his sessions, he magnetized one of his male servants, and to his surprise, the young man entered a peaceful, sleep-like trance instead of experiencing a crisis. In this trance, the young man responded to Puységur's voice, answered his questions, and even performed complicated activities on command. He spoke about his work, pretended to shoot for a prize, and danced happily to imagined music. Upon wakening, he had no recollection of these events. After being remagnetized and returning to a trance-like state, he could recall the memories. Puységur discovered that he could replicate this process in other patients and avoid the whole crisis phase by articulating it clearly with words. He coined the term artificial somnambulism for this new state as it resembled sleepwalking. He and his colleagues began using this technique and found other insights while treating their patients. They realized they had to listen carefully to the individual seeking relief. Often the client would confront painful emotions while discussing their issues in the presence of the person doing the magnetism. The sessions had to be of regular frequency and duration so that a patient would return for multiple treatments. The magnetists themselves had to be neutral and patient, and the symptoms might return temporarily in between sessions, but if you stuck with it, you could possibly relieve these symptoms in the patient. So you can see a lot of this is like breaking new ground with mesmerism, but it was still not catching on with the main medical community because by this point, it was considered just a faddish, sham sort of treatment. But some scientists and doctors continued to work on it on the side. First, there was Faria, a Portuguese priest who had lived in India before settling in Paris. He wondered why not everyone responded equally well to the magnetism induction procedure. He discovered that anyone who was appropriately predisposed to the induction could be put into one of these trances, but people differed in how susceptible they were to this. He argued that it had to do with the thinness of the blood. So people who had thinner blood were less susceptible to this. Even though this theory was wrong, he did help change the emphasis from it as being the ability of the person doing the mesmerism to the characteristics of the person being mesmerized. John Elliotson was a physician in London's University College Hospital in 1837. He had seen a stage mesmerist and was intrigued by what he saw, and he planned to investigate its properties as an anesthesia for surgery. But when they heard these plans, the University Council passed a resolution instructing the hospital board to ban the practice of mesmerism or animal magnetism in the hospital. So Elliotson ended up resigning his position in protest. He continued practicing medicine privately, using mesmerism as a technique, and found it so fruitful that he even started a new journal called Zeist in 1843. That was an outlet to publish research on mesmerism. It only lasted until 1856, and Elliotson himself was never really able to make much of an impact on the medical community. Then we have James Esdale, a Scottish physician practicing in India. In India, he trained his assistants to magnetize patients before their operations, and thus he became the first person to employ mesmeric anesthesia on a large scale and tabulate his results. He performed more than 300 operations involving mesmerism in the late 1840s, many of them for removing scrotal tumors. Among his mesmerized patients, the mortality rate, that is, the percentage of patients who died from the operation, went from the normal 50% down to 5%. Unfortunately, his results were dismissed because both the assistants and the patients were Indians, and the British medical establishment had a racist belief that these weren't typical people because Indian patients liked to be operated on and were merely acting to help Esdale. So no one took these findings very seriously. Also during that period, significant advancements were being made in chemical anesthesia techniques. Horace Wells, for instance, developed a local anesthesia chemical in 1844 that could be administered during a tooth extraction. Similarly, William Morton developed a general anesthesia in 1840 that could render a person unconscious during a surgical operation. As a result of the abundance of these chemical anesthesia options, there was a decrease in interest in using mesmerism for anesthesia. However, it's worth noting that James Braid, a Scottish physician, approached mesmerism from a more scientific perspective. He had seen a stage mesmerist perform, and he later worked with that mesmerist on one of his own patients to show that when they were mesmerized, the patient had less sensitivity to pain. So Braid continued a series of controlled experiments and demonstrated the full range of mesmeric effects that others had already documented in the previous decades. He thought that the trance that happened when you were mesmerized was something akin to sleep, and so in 1843 he coined a new term calling it neurohypnology, from the Greek roots of neuro for the nervous system and hypnos for sleep. And he used this neurology part to cover the range of mesmeric phenomena that he already knew about. He later changed this simply to hypnotism, which gave then mesmerism a new and more respectable name, which became the term that everybody used from then on. Around this time, a French doctor named Auguste Liébault was experimenting with hypnotic therapies. He offered free treatment to patients who gazed deeply into his eyes while he gave them instructions. Symptoms vanished quickly, and he gained many patients. Liébault eventually charged for his services and wrote a book about his treatment. In this book, he argued that the hypnotic state resembles normal sleep, except that the subject remains in a constant conscious rapport with the hypnotist throughout. Not many people bought the book, as Liébault sold only a handful of copies. But a young doctor from the city of Nancy in France, Hippolyte Bernheim, came across this book and visited Liébault in 1882. He soon abandoned his traditional ways of treating patients and became a full-time hypnotherapist, treating hundreds of patients and carefully analyzing their responses to hypnotism. Bernheim studied the characteristics of individuals who could be hypnotized. He found that those from lower social classes were more receptive, he believed, due to their conditioning to follow orders. Bernheim's approach to hypnotherapy, called the Nancy School, emphasized individual characteristics and was featured in medical journals. That leads us to our next character in this mesmerism to hypnotism storyline, and that's Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was the son of a carriage builder, and he chose medicine over art as a career. As a relatively impoverished medical student, he had been required to work in Paris's Salpêtrière Hospital. This enormous women's hospital housed several thousand indigent and ill women in over 40 buildings. This wasn't considered a desirable location for a doctor to work, but Charcot thought that the Salpêtrière would be a potential treasure trove of neurological cases, so he resolved that he would return to it once he was an established senior physician. He finished medical school, and he became a private physician and a traveling companion to a wealthy banker, and then he used his contacts with the wealthy banker to establish a flourishing private practice. Interestingly, like Mesmer, he married a wealthy widow, and this helped him enter into the higher echelons of Parisian society. When he was finally financially secure, he returned to the Salpêtrière as a senior physician in 1862. That hospital still exists, and it's still quite a fantastic place. In 2014, I visited the hospital. I just walked into the grounds one early morning, and you can see how nice the architecture is there. This is the hospital also where they took Princess Diana when she was dying from that car accident back in 1997. That's where she passed away. The hospital is still functioning and has a lot of different buildings, and there's all sorts of beautiful architecture there. It was originally set up as an insane asylum and now has been converted into one of the major hospitals in Paris. Well, anyway, back to Charcot. Charcot became a renowned neurologist who expanded research and teaching facilities at the Salpêtrière Hospital in 1862. He conducted significant research on neurological diseases such as epilepsy and multiple sclerosis. Charcot's lectures became popular cultural events, attracting audiences of writers, philosophers, famous actresses, and doctors. His achievements were recognized by the French government in 1882 when they created a new post, Professor of Neuropathology, specifically for him. Charcot believed that neurological diseases occurred either in a pure and complete form or more commonly in a partial or incomplete form, and he observed a large number of patients to support his research. He would gather patients with the same disease and observe them to determine the common characteristics. He would use the terms grand and petite to describe whether or not a patient had all the characteristics of the disease. This is still used today when referring, for example, to grand mal seizures versus petite mal seizures. The study of hysteria in the 1870s revealed patients with symptoms mimicking neurological disease but with no physical cause. Hysterics showed uncharacteristic symptoms, including paralysis and anesthesia in specific body parts. These symptoms did not follow accepted rules of neurology. The word hysteria dates back to the ancient Greeks. Hippocrates and others believed that hysteria was an exclusively feminine disease caused by the physical wandering of the uterus. That is, the uterus would form in the abdomen and then would move around to other parts of the body and cause symptoms to occur. So as therapy, the ancient Greeks often prescribed a foul-smelling substance to be rubbed on the inflicted areas, and then a sweet smell on some other part of the abdomen to entice the uterus to return to its proper place. And sometimes this seemed to help, but later the great physician Galen recognized that the uterus itself couldn't wander. It's fixed there. And he refined the theory by suggesting that the organ instead gave off some sort of pathogenic fluid or vapor that collected at different symptom sites. He prescribed using smelling salts to disperse and dilute these vapors, and sometimes his treatment was followed by improvement. When Charcot began to study hysteria 17 centuries later, most medical thinking about hysteria had not improved much. The prevailing medical opinion dismissed hysteria as just simple malingering, that these symptoms violated the accepted rules of neuroanatomy and strained the credulity of many mechanistically oriented doctors. And there was still this overwhelming belief that this was a feminine disease related to an abnormal reproductive system. Charcot challenged both these views, first of all by stating that hysterical symptoms were too distressing to be faked. And secondly, he had observed several men outside the hospital who showed identical symptoms. And because of the latter, that meant to Charcot that it had nothing to do with female reproduction. Charcot studied hysteria by observing patients and identified the pure type of the condition. Major hysterical attacks had a 4-stage progression, and patients who didn't exhibit this sequence had minor hysteria. Charcot believed that the root cause of hysteria was a hereditary degeneracy of the nervous system. He also observed similarities between hypnotized subjects and hysterical symptoms, and some of his prized patients were highly hypnotizable. From this coincidence, Charcot concluded that hypnotic susceptibility was a symptom of hysteria. Only people with pathological nervous systems should experience such dissociable effects, deciding that hypnosis deserved further study as an aspect of hysteria. Charcot reasoned that the best cases to examine hypnosis closely would be the best cases of hysteria. Thus, his major hysterics started doing double duty, serving as prime exemplars of hypnotic susceptibility in the Salpêtre research. Now, Charcot's assistants would do most of the actual hypnotizing in the research. And one of the more important subjects was this woman named Blanche Whitman, or Wit, because of her particular performance on the stage and her sort of haughty attitude that she would have towards the other patients. She even had the nickname Queen of the Hysterics. As you can see here, she's depicted in this famous painting of Charcot, standing in front of everyone in a public lecture. Charcot has Wit sort of passed out on his arm. When hypnotized, other major hysterical patients would pass through 3 stages. First, catalepsy, where they would become muscularly relaxed, motionless, and generally insensitive to external stimulation. 2, lethargy, where the body muscles were flaccid but sporadically activated into strong contractions and movements. And 3, finally, somnambulism. These were complex automatic movements and actions that would occur upon suggestion. This resembled the deep trances of the early magnetic and hypnotic subjects. Again, Charcot noted that some of these hypnotic subjects were likelier to follow all 3 stages in order and were labeled as having the grand version of hypnosis. In contrast, others had 1 to 2 of these stages and therefore they had the petite version. So I guess in this painting, we can see that Wit is either in the catalepsy stage or the lethargy stage because it looks like she's lost control of her muscles. Charcot and his assistants did some serious research on this, and they even published some images of these hysterics going through hypnosis. In 1882, he presented his theory to the French Academy of Sciences, where the subject of hypnotism had been an official disgrace in France ever since the Franklin Commission with Mesmer. The Academy had twice since rejected reports on it, but Charcot had immense prestige at this point, and that ensured that he would be carefully heard. In fact, his neurologically oriented theory appealed to the mechanistic basis of the scientific establishment, and thus his presentation was met with enthusiastic approval. Charcot was able to legitimize hypnotism as a subject of study by an official French scientific organization. It was around this time, in 1885, when Freud came to spend a year with Charcot to learn about hysteria and hypnosis from the master. As I detail in another video, Freud then took these ideas back to Vienna. Now, just as hypnotism was getting scientific respect, controversies about it broke out. Remember that Bernheim of the Nancy School was hypnotizing hundreds of subjects himself instead of just a select handful at the Salpietra. And Bernheim concluded that hypnotic susceptibility was a variable normal characteristic present in many people who are not suffering from major hysteria. In his patients, the states of catalepsy and lethargy had not inevitably been followed by somnambulism. Thus, he attacked Charcot's theory and charged that major hypnotism was in fact an artifact of this particular setting they had at the hospital. Charcot and his disciples reacted angrily, and the dispute began filling French scientific literature. Serious questioning of Charcot's theory also began in the mid-1880s when Charcot's young assistants, Alfred Binet, who later worked on mental testing, and Charles Féré, reported some surprising experiments with Blanche Whitman. They had reintroduced the use of magnets in their hypnotic sessions. With Wit in her somnambulism stage, they induced paralysis or other effects on one side of her body, then reversed the polarity of a large magnet they held in front of her, and her effects would immediately transfer to the other side, and they could do this for her emotional states as well. After telling the hypnotized Wit that she would feel very sad, they would transform her pious sobs into happy laughter with a simple flick of their magnet. In all seriousness, they suggested that here was an experimental technique for discovering pairs of complementary emotions analogous to complementary colors that researchers in vision had already discovered. But the logic of these experiments seemed suspicious to Joseph Delboeuf, a respected Belgian physiologist. He came to watch a demonstration of the magnetism effect and soon detected that Wit was more of an actress than anything, who skillfully did exactly what was expected of her. Delboeuf asked the men to turn off the electricity on the magnet so that it would look like the polarity was changing just to see if she would still swap sides, but they refused to do this. So he went back to Belgium, repeated the demonstration, and finding that, like Mesmer's subjects, all of these effects had more to do with suggestion than actual magnetism. Charcot was forced to admit there were errors with his approach, but his reputation remained solid because of all the other advances he had already made. Now, as I end this story, I have to tell you about the fact that many, many years ago, I was in Paris for the very first time, and I was, just like a lot of other people in their 20s, very curious about seeing Jim Morrison's grave in a Paris cemetery. And so I had come with my girlfriend out to one of these cemeteries, and I'm at the cemetery looking for Morrison's grave, and we never found it. And while we're walking through this cemetery, we came upon Charcot's grave. And I had been studying Charcot, knew about Charcot, so I was really excited about seeing Charcot's grave. So there. Instead of Jim Morrison, I saw Charcot's grave. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story of hypnosis and hysteria. If you liked it, please consider giving me a like, and then you can watch one of these videos about Freud next. Until next time, stay curious.